Hello, welcome to the webinar on securing your digital enterprise, new tools and strategies for better cyber defense. My name is Brian Alexander, Director of Sales for BMC Software in the security operations space. And joining me today is John Fraser, Managing Director of Service Management for Online Business Systems. Welcome, John. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you, Brian.
And today, John and I would like to talk to what is really an unprecedented situation around security. And you've seen it everywhere. You have seen every week new headlines hitting the news. And both of us are talking to many organizations on how they're dealing with really what is an unprecedented situation. So tell me, John, what are you seeing when you're talking to CISOs and operations people from some of the largest companies across the Americas?
They're throwing their hands up in frustration. As you can see from the slide of logos, you probably recognize quite a number of them that have had some very high-profile breaches over the past few years. And continuously, both the CISOs and the CIOs cringe and hope they're not seeing their logos in the newspaper. They're frustrated by a number of factors, including lack of resources, and they just feel like they're continuously trying to play catch-up. Most recently, we've seen a very high-profile breach at Equifax. Brian, you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, what is there to tell that hasn't already made the news? Absolutely, Equifax, and we joke that we should talk about Equifax, but in reality, how much more can we talk about Equifax? What's interesting to me about Equifax, and there are many things in the news. Richard Smith, the former CEO, was just testifying in front of Congress. What's really interesting about Equifax, and something that's sort of striking to me beyond the headlines, is how a company that's $3.1 billion, has almost 10,000 employees, an IT budget in well over $100 million. According to the CEO, IT security was breached because one guy failed to do one thing. And that speaks to me as, probably not quite the real facts. He is now the former CEO, and I'm sure that he's had tremendous amounts of counsel, but it really cuts to what is a very interesting problem, and that is that process is not in place. And in this case, that process wasn't followed. It wasn't followed in terms of patching an Apache Struts vulnerability, and the result is that you've got 145 million records breached. And we keep getting new details about this, right? We are now seeing that part of that breach was salary histories. When you start thinking that there are only 213 million American consumers, and a good portion, I'm sure, of some of those consumers don't actually need credit because they're older, you probably run a pretty high chance of being in that breach. So what it really speaks to is, had proper process been in place, had technology, process, and people been working together, it probably would have been a very different story. When you're talking to your own clients and your own teams, how did that story play out, John?
Yeah, so one of the things we're seeing is it's really a risk problem. Cyber risk is now obviously an enterprise concern, going back to the plethora of logos we're seeing there. It's changed from just being an IT or a security problem to a top-of-mind issue among CEOs and more importantly, boards of directors. Boards of directors are becoming much more savvy, and in fact, they're also being held to account by a number of regulations across the U.S. and globally. The problem is even more acute within regulated sectors, so things like financial services, healthcare, and energy are really being impacted by tightening cybersecurity regulations. And with the advent of GDPR coming out of Europe, any company that operates in Europe globally is going to be affected by tightening data privacy and security regulations. Companies are just ill-prepared to respond. Back to your comment, they're just not ready to respond to this. They're not patching properly. They don't have the processes in place. One of the real reasons is because the ownership of the problem is murky. No one really knows who owns this problem and then across the organization. And unfortunately, the problem is only going to get worse before it gets better, because the customer hackers and thieves are getting far more sophisticated than the companies that are trying to respond to the problems.
Absolutely.
Some of the challenges we're seeing, there's recognized silos between SecOps and IT ops. So these organizations are both experts in their fields, but they have diametrically opposed missions in the enterprise. SecOps is there to keep the company completely safe. IT operations is there to keep the company up and running all of the time, and often they're at odds with each other trying to do this. One of the other problems is poor documentation of vulnerabilities and threats, lack of audit trails. So it's one thing if the security operations team finds a threat or a vulnerability, it's quite another to track the chain of custody from beginning to end through an organization. And the regulations, and even when you're getting into court cases, when there's class action suits, are requiring to see that chain of custody. Security and IT resources are overextended, and unfortunately, they're getting poor results because they just don't have the resources. Unknown M&A risk. So one of the big challenges out there today as companies grow through mergers and acquisitions is they don't know what they're buying. They have poor due diligence when it comes to security threats and vulnerabilities in the companies that they buy, and we've actually seen companies acquire others, consume them into their IT operations group, and be exposed to security threats and vulnerabilities, even though they had their own house in order. Supply chain risk. So in our increasingly interconnected world with our vendor community, even again, if your security operations group is tight and crisp, you're connected to your vendors, and several of the hacks, including Home Depot a few years back, happened through third-party vendors and not through their own IT group. One of the challenges in trying to get the resources to address this is IT and security are challenged to communicate the risk in business terms. So the CEOs and the boards who can fund this and help drive this forward aren't hearing the right messages from IT and security. And then finally, one of the biggest challenges we're seeing today is weak asset inventories. Organizations just don't understand the scope of their exposure. They don't understand what's in their environment.
Well, so it's interesting you mentioned that, because that is really, I think, if you drill down and you talk about the security state, those unknowns are even complicated the situation more. And I'll actually talk to some very, very interesting metrics here that sort of paint a rather dire picture. It's interesting you mentioned that M&A. Yahoo last week just actually disclosed that it wasn't 1 billion records hacked, it was 3 billion. And of course, the Verizon purchase of Yahoo was actually reduced because of this hack, right? So there's real world tangible examples. For most organizations, though, it is a situation of not placing your chips in the right place. And the teams are working extremely hard, but they often don't have the resources to cover all of the different areas of exposure. And you sort of see this as a lot of metrics play out. And, 5 that really, to me, crystallize the problem are sort of, one, in this case, it says 43% of companies. I think it's safe to probably assume that over 50% of companies have had a data breach. But what's interesting about that is in those data breaches, 80% of the time, they've been caused by known vulnerabilities. So the company has known about the vulnerability and it was working to fix it, theoretically, but did not do so in time, so there was a data breach. Equifax, probably a great example, right? They knew there was a vulnerability, but they had not taken the correct action in time, and they got hacked. What's fascinating about this is that on average, to get a vulnerability remediated from the infrastructure, it takes 193 days. And that 193 days hasn't actually changed over the last 2 to 3 years. It's sort of still just over 6 months. That's just for normal vulnerability. However, when you look at, of those vulnerabilities that have caused data breaches, 99.9% of them have had a solution available for over a year. That talks to a far darker picture. that is really where organizations are not actually even getting to all of their infrastructure, and sort of links back to your comment. They don't have good visibility into what is out there. I think that a lot of these vulnerabilities come from systems that organizations don't perceive as priority. And we talk about limited resources. Security teams will put their energy where they feel the most risk is. But when you think that the average attacker stays in the corporate network for 205 days on average, that really brings new light to the idea that you need to not just protecting your perimeter or your production environment, but your entire environment, because that's where they lurk. And when organizations don't have full visibility into their environment, they can't prioritize, they don't have business context, and they may not even be managing a surprising percentage of their assets. Here, 1 in 3 data center servers are undermanaged, and there are estimates out there that between 12 to 18% are actually unmanaged. And you can think many of those may be temporary development boxes that have been spun up and just sit out there because developers don't want to give them back, but they can accrue vulnerabilities. And as we saw with previous vulnerabilities, organizations can believe that they have fixed everything, but they will spring up because they're embedded in process or systems. And then finally, when you do want to remediate, if you are doing traditional or manual process, it's very time-consuming and error-prone, which contributes to the problem. So 80% of downtime is due to misconfiguration, and often that is the result of fingers on keyboards or scripts that aren't quite right. From your perspective, how do you see this problem playing out across not just the operations folks, but the security folks as well?
Well, interestingly enough, the problem impacts everybody. It's not just security and operations who are impacted and who have a stake in this. We talked about the board of directors in the C-suite. We had a little bit of a discussion around M&A teams, but in-house legal, audit, risk, and compliance groups are becoming involved. Marketing, when there is a breach, how do they deal with the breach? HR, when you start getting into privacy and particularly GDPR and the supply chain, there's a lot of people involved in this. It's a complicated problem. More hands are jumping into the soup, and it makes it even more challenging for IT and security operations to deal with it. Really what we need to do is we need to think about the problem differently because it's such a complex problem. We need to look at the people first, who's involved. We need to talk about the process. And then finally, we need to make sure that we have the right technology to support it. At Online, what we've done is we've developed a security integration framework. It's really a roadmap for enterprise risk management. And it's a methodology, it's processes, it's tools, and it really is about integrating security operations and IT operations. And it aligns the people first, unifies the process and then finally integrates technology to minimize risk for business. And it's really got to go in that order. If you don't deal with the people problem first and then the process, all the best technology in the world is not going to solve your problem. We've built our framework around a number of foundational frameworks. NIST, CSF for cybersecurity frameworks, Center for Internet Security, the top 20 controls, ITIL, COBIT. These are all things that are recognized by the professionals in both security and IT operations. And they give them a foundation to collaborate and come together to work on this problem. Again, back to the critical dimensions: people, then process, then technology. Really, what our framework is, it's a set of tools, starting with an assessment that helps companies understand where their challenges lie. It's about a 4,000 data point assessment that looks at people, process, and technology and gives them a score and lets them understand where they need to focus their energies first. It helps them to put some of the challenges in the business perspective, so it aligns some of their challenge areas back to business services and help have that discussion with the business. And then really at the end of the day, once they have an understanding of where their problems lie, we can start identifying some quick wins. And quick wins often focus on technology. There's a lot of technology out there that can help solve this problem. Online's worked very closely with BMC over the last year and a half to help develop a framework of technology. It's not all BMC technology, but there is a lot of BMC technology involved that could help to address the challenges of identifying, assessing, and then remediating the security problems. First and foremost, as Brian and I were both talking about earlier, understanding what you have in your environment is critical. Making sure that you have a complete and accurate asset inventory is probably one of the biggest challenges we're seeing in the industry today. And I would say all of the organizations that we're talking to today have that problem. Once they have that accurate inventory, they need to understand how all of the pieces fit together and how they support the underlying business services. Anyone we talk to today in security operations says that one of their biggest challenges is understanding what to work on first. They work with a plethora of tools that help identify threats and vulnerabilities. And unfortunately, each one of these tools has their own ranking system, and none of the ranking systems really identify the severity of threat against a particular business service. So they don't have the business context involved. Definitely after that, BMC's got a number of great tools to help manage the workflow of security remediation and vulnerability remediation, including a critical part of the process, which is proper management procedures. We're seeing a lot of companies out there in the industry today that are saying that they can solve these problems in seconds and minutes, but unfortunately, without good process behind the scenes, they break a lot of the rules and regulations and expose the company to greater threats and vulnerabilities because they're not following that proper procedure. Brian?
Well, that's a great place to actually start talking, process being extremely important, but also what is the technology and what are the integrated capabilities that underpin that process. From a BMC perspective, we really focus on secure operations as something that brings together multiple capabilities from multiple disciplines, right? Being able to effectively execute on vulnerability management and automation, but then also integrating and using back to the discovery data that you're talking about to bring business context to the vulnerabilities within the infrastructure, and then as well linking that back and having a closed loop to ensure that all activities in the vulnerability management lifecycle are validated and your infrastructure is secure, which I think really dovetails to the larger picture that you just presented there. Now, if we were to drill down, visibility is everything when you're trying to understand what you have out there and whether or not it's properly managed. So one of the capabilities that we bring to bear is really blind spot detection. It is being able to integrate with discovery data to understand what infrastructure is out there that isn't being scanned by your scanners or managed by your configuration management solution, and triangulating that data to ensure that your estate is properly covered and ensuring that all infrastructure is brought into that process. So we call that blind spot detection, right? We talked earlier, 12 to 18% of the infrastructure probably isn't managed. And the reality is that needs to be managed. The second part of that is bringing business context to the equation. Security has limited resources. They need to be able to understand, not just from day one, what should be the highest priorities and what should be executed on, but to be able to quickly change tack and reprioritize how they're executing. So being able to use that discovery data, map the dependencies of the infrastructure, and then be able to understand the business context of vulnerabilities is very key. More and more you see a lot of businesses driving tremendous revenue through business services that are application-based. And understanding what the risk profile or vulnerability profile for those business services is something that organizations really need to get to so that they can have far greater predictability that their business is safe.
And Brian, if I could just jump in for 1 second, One of the challenges that companies are facing today, it's actually twofold challenges, is their business application architecture is moving to multiple locations. It could reside in multiple different cloud infrastructure, so Amazon Web Services or Azure, and some of it on site, so they could have it in multiple cloud locations. Advanced DevOps, we're seeing changes happening in hours and minutes instead of the former quarters and annual changes. And so keeping up with these without a tool is impossible. Our director of our security operations group says it's just an impossible task, and he sees it becoming a greater challenge over the next 2 to 3 years, where companies, if they thought they were keeping up before, are just no longer able.
That's a very good point, John. And it actually sort of talks to exactly what BMC has been doing around discovery there. We recently came out with what we call multi-cloud capability. And that allows you to use the same discovery solution on your existing traditional infrastructure and all of your multi-cloud infrastructure, so that you can create one holistic, accurate, real-time map of all of your assets, be they your traditional server or containers you've got in the cloud. And to your point, that becomes so critical because applications are spanning both areas and evolving very quickly. So the second area is a route to vulnerability intelligence. And in the next slide, I'll drill down a little more about this. But at a high level, what we're doing is being able to take all the data which is created by scanning solutions. Typically, when we focus on that, it's Rapid7, Qualys, and Nessus. They produce tremendous amounts of data. Being able to action that data and understand that data is key. So we help with that. Once you are able to bring context to that data, you're able to then execute far more efficient and automated remediation across diverse infrastructure. And then finally, bringing visibility to the equation. Traditionally, security and operations haven't had visibility into how vulnerabilities are being managed across the life cycle. So being able to have real-time management and understanding and automation to that process helps organizations dramatically reduce the exposure window that they have to deal with for vulnerabilities. And to really sort of bring more detail to it, I call this the 5 bottlenecks of SecOps. We talked about vulnerability scanners being able to scan a tremendous amount of infrastructure. Well, they produce tremendous amounts of data. And that data typically is organized by IP address, something that is not very useful to operations. So operations gets this data from security every week, every 2 weeks, maybe a slightly different frequency. And it takes a tremendous amount of work to actually translate that data into something that they can actually act on. And we estimate that up to 40% of that data that security sends over to operations has already been sent. It's double work, right? And in a climate where you have limited resources and a whole lot of threat, this is something that is certainly extra baggage that is not needed, right? For operations, we estimate that on average, there's between 2 to 4 FTE that have the role of translating that vulnerability data and executing it per 1,000 servers of the infrastructure. Here, it says 1 to 2, just to be conservative, but it's actually a little bit higher than that. When you start extrapolating that over a large environment, and let's say 10,000 servers, that could be 20 to 40 people. And of course, that work can be spread across a larger number of people, but when you think that that can be automated, that bottleneck can be removed, the 40% of work can be removed, this frees up really, really important resources to be able to go do higher order things or execute more activity to secure the business, right? And then the third bottleneck is that business context, right? Not understanding whether or not those vulnerabilities really, really impact the organization or not. So traditionally, organizations have chosen their prioritization based on the severity level of the vulnerability, whether it's in production or not in production, etc. Here, you're adding a new element which allows a far greater understanding what the real impact to the organization in general is for the vulnerabilities that are found. Remediation then is automated. Traditional remediation is slow, error-prone, and fragmented. What we're able to do here across all platforms is execute intelligent, automated remediation of those vulnerabilities and drastically reduce the amount of time it takes to remediate them from the enterprise. And of course, the last piece, which we joke is the last mile, it might take a server admin only 5 minutes to really fix a vulnerability, but it could take him 45 minutes to put in all the proper change records and requests. So here, being able to automate that element as well dramatically reduces the hurdles towards getting the infrastructure far more secure. When we are talking about multi-tier remediation, infrastructure is getting far more complex. So multi-tier remediation becomes a far more important element. How are we able to bring automation to complex architectures and be able to remediate those vulnerabilities in a way which does not impact the business through far greater automation and intelligent automation? And then validate that those activities have been done. There's an estimate out there that 47% of web servers have vulnerabilities. And that's mildly scary. But that exists because application owners don't want anybody touching their critical infrastructure. If we're able to automate, then those hurdles can be lowered because there's far greater predictability of success. Now, we talked earlier about visibility. The final piece to that is collaboration. How are we able to bring integrated security and operational data to security and operations so that everybody is working off the same page? What you're seeing here is a quick collaboration space where you are seeing the vulnerabilities in the enterprise, how they've been scored, how old they are, and then, of course, how the overall enterprise is doing in terms of their vulnerability burn down. This becomes key to ensuring that you don't have that double work, to ensuring that security and operations are working off the same page, able to see that data, set SLAs against that data, and because of the inclusion of business context data and the establishment of those SLAs, and the fact that everybody's working off the same page, you now have the ability for far more intelligent and real-time prioritization of where the organization is spending its resources to fix whatever vulnerability is the most pressing to the business.
Brian, one of the things that we're seeing, and one of the comments that we're getting from clients, in fact, one of the best ones I've heard, is this becomes the center of trust between security operations and IT operations. It's a common interface that they can collaborate together, and it solves that people problem. They certainly have those silos, and this helps break the silo down because they're working in a common interface that allows them to collaborate and yet allows them to segregate the things that are important to them and prevent, IT operations is prevented from seeing some of the sensitive data that security can see, and vice versa. Security operations is prevented from executing the critical IT operations data. So this becomes the center of trust and breaks down that barrier and builds the sense of collaboration.
Exactly, and it's interesting. One of the metrics I track is when I talk to organizations, how many of them are actually setting up joint SecOps teams? Because traditionally, security and operations really haven't worked very well together. That is changing, and these capabilities are really designed to help with that change, get everybody on the same page, and be able to, in reality, do far more work in far less time so that you can reduce your exposure windows significantly. Now, one comment that I'd make is we really have sort of two parts to the equation here. The first one is really traditional infrastructure, and everything that we've described so far is focused on operating systems, your system packages, libraries, etc. We are able to bring these capabilities and these solutions to Blade Logic from a server automation point of view and Microsoft SCCM also from infrastructure automation. And what that really does is, no matter your remediation solution, you're able to have the automation, visibility, and collaboration for the vulnerability streams. Cloud, though, is a little bit different, and it's a little different in the way that you need to actually execute compliance in it. Traditional compliance is really a pull. You go out, get the data, analyze that data, and execute action. When you bring cloud and DevOps into the equation, and you start thinking about how you need to bring compliance not just to infrastructure items, but cloud services that you're consuming, the landscape is different. And you really have to have the capability of executing in much more an event-driven, fast way that is integrated into your DevOps pipeline or other operations. So from that point of view, we also have the capability that comes from BMC Policy Service. And together, these are able to bring holistic compliance and vulnerability management to your infrastructure no matter where it is located. Finally, a quick example. Transamerica, large insurance organization, really is a good example of speaking to how, when you get compliance automated and under control, it can have dramatic impacts in terms of the amount of time that it takes to deal with what is a big compliance load. In their case, being able to automate those compliance regulations that they must adhere to resulted in a 95% reduction in labor and time. And that is them being able to not just do far more with far less, but use that extra time to add greater layers of security and capability to their organization. What I'd really like to do is transition now and open the line for questions. John and I are happy to answer any questions that may come about. So if you would like to put your questions into the chat window,